Welcome to the Deep Dive, the advanced web development podcast brought to you by indep.dev. Hi people, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we have three special guests. The first one is Nacho Vazquez. He's from Havana, Cuba. He's currently working and living in Uruguay. He's an ex-water polo player. He's a scuba diver. He has a bachelor in computer science. And he's a software architecture enthusiast. He's also a writer at indep.dev. And I have a couple of fun facts about Nacho, and he will have no chance of explaining any of them. The first fun fact about Nacho is that he almost studied cinematographic arts instead of computer science. So let that one hang for a minute. And the other fun fact, he's my personal one-man fan base, the one and only. Our next guest, Nate Lapinski. He's currently working and living in Tokyo, Japan. He's a tech speaker with 7 years of developer experience, mostly full stack. He prefers web and front-end frameworks like React and Angular. He refactored a very large and very old ES3 codebase into a modern modular system using Redux and Redux Saga. And he's currently working with a lot of React and GraphQL projects, but he enjoys writing about both React, RxJS, and Angular. And now there's a bunch of fun facts about Nate. He has been in the industry long enough to have written end-to-end tests using Slimer.js. He built a React Redux app just to learn Japanese. Despite Nate living near a lot of great ski spots for most of his life, he has only gone skiing or snowboarding in total one time in his life. But it was a lot of fun. Another fun fact about Nate is that he only has low resolution photos online, and he finds most other programming languages very boring, with one exception, which is Haskell. That fascinates him and scares him at the same time, makes him want to cry. Our final guest today is Max Koretskyi. He lives in Kiev, Ukraine, but he's working remote for a Canadian company called Narwhal. He's a tech speaker. He grew the world's largest Angular publication called Angular In Depth. And then he founded indep.dev, which sponsors this podcast. He was a developer advocate for AG Grid, and now he's a senior engineer at Narwhal. He has a Master of Science in Business Economics. Another fun fact, he brought his mother to NgVikings 2019 in Copenhagen, Denmark. And he Forrest Gumped a Stack Overflow reputation of 75,801 points. And the thing he said when I asked was, so I went for the 10k reputation, and when I got there, I thought maybe I'd go for 25k. And when I got there, I thought maybe I'd just go for the 50k mark. And when I got there, and the interview ended there. So, welcome everyone. I hope you have nothing to add, because you will have no chance to add any more detail than that. So Nate, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Cool, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Max Koretskyi, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Cool, yeah. Glad to be here to discuss React and Angular.
So now we'll move on to the main topic of the day. And today we will actually discuss both React and Angular. In particular, what is it like to switch from one to the other and maybe back? What's the challenges with both of these frameworks, and what's the challenge when switching from one to the other? So, who wants to go first? Nacho, you started in Angular, but then you moved to also doing React. You're actually doing both in your jobs right now. So, what was it like to feel very proficient in Angular and then learning this new framework, React? What was that experience like?
That's really interesting, because at the same time I start moving from Angular to React, I start to think how it will be to move from React to Angular. So let's start with the reality, what this was for me. So when you're moving from Angular to React, you will notice some difference between the two tools. It's obvious. Your first encounter will be generally with components, and you start to notice that you don't need modules anymore. So you just write components, and it actually feels natural to just go and write a component without the use of a module. So that part is not a problem. And if you are an Angular
So so in React we are importing the components directly that we're using in our components.
Exactly.
Our child components.
Exactly.
So in Angular we have this layer of indirection that is the NgModule. So that's very different. So, and you're saying you got used to the React way pretty quickly. So looking back, would you get rid of NgModules if you could in Angular, or do you see some benefit of the NgModule?
I believe that at this point, having tree checking dependencies in Angular, you are not in such a need of modules. I believe modules had a big importance in orchestrating dependencies and making dependency injection work the way it worked. But right now, I think, and I have read your articles, and I believe that yes, it should be some step forward in the future of Angular to get rid of modules and start using tree checking components as well. So it feels natural, yeah, because you actually don't need to think too much. You just write a component and that's it. You may feel it a bit weird at first, but then you get used really quickly to this way of developing.
In Angular, though, we can just slap all the components in one NgModule, and then we can just use whatever component we like in our templates without having any imports. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but you have the problem with lazy loading then. And that's maybe the most important thing that I use, or the most impactful for my developing life is for using them to lazy loading modules with components. I know you can lazy load directly components, but it's not that baked in the framework and the routing system. So I prefer to use more like your scamps, which is using single module for a single component, just a one-to-one relationship there. And that way is more like the React way. You will only have to create this extra boilerplate for your component, but that's basically it. And just then use this module to lazy load your component.
How do you set up that boundary in React of lazy loading components? Like setting up a border saying beyond this point, these components are lazy loaded. How do you do that in React?
Well, you use the ES6 import, and you just import your model. You're using the routing. You have, I have to remember right because I'm primarily using Next.js now, and it's a bit different. But I think you have a lazy attribute in your routing. In Next.js, you have a dynamic import, like the way they do it is more like idioms to each library, but it's more similar the way you will do it using dynamic modules and lazy loading modules in just JavaScript with ES6. So that part is not that hard because I have used lazy loading before in just JavaScript and JavaScript backend framework. So it's more the JavaScript way, that part. And at that point, you will start probably using class component because it's the most similar to Angular. If you came from Angular, you will focus on doing class components, which have constructor, which have inheritance, which has life cycles, and it's more familiar to the starter one. You have to look to the life cycles, how they work, may be some different. I actually don't use life cycles and class component too much. I immediately start converting to this functional way of doing because it seems super interesting and attractive to me to get more mixed up in functional programming and having even components being functions seems like a nice hook for me. And then you have hooks. And is that is when things start to seem a bit different. When you start using hooks, you have to change your mindset, because the user state hook and the way the state is managed in class components in React is not that different. You have a state and you have a set-state function. And between the benefits is that you don't have to worry about binding this keyword like you have to do in components. It's something that is more easier because everything is a function. And the useEffect hook is where things start to get interesting, because you have several lifecycle hooks inside one if you want to think about it that way. But it's not actually it. It's more like how to react to, and I think React is more reactive since you have functional components, because you, through the useEffect, you are actually reacting to changes, and you have to listen for things that you are important to that part of code. So
the good thing about this useEffect hook is that you can kind of put two pieces of logic together and saying this is one piece, and one part of that piece is the initialization logic setup, and the other part is the teardown. Like when this component is destroyed, what do we need to remove, like event listeners or unsubscribe from an RxJS observable or whatever, close a WebSocket or something like that. Whereas in Angular and with the class-based React components, you would have those two pieces in separate lifecycle hooks. So you don't have this principle of proximity, that the two pieces that are obviously coupled to each other, they are not in the same place in the code. So they are mixed with other pieces from other pieces of behavior in these lifecycle hooks. So I like that thing about the useEffect hook.
Yeah, I think they're great. I totally agree with you. And you also have this cleanup function that you return, and that does that thing that you're mentioning. But it not only do it at the destroy phase, but it does every time your effect is going to be called again or leaving the functionality. So you can do very cool stuff like canceling HTTP requests or destroying tie-ups if they are not up already.
Nice.
So you have to change your mental model about it, because it's not just the destroy part, but I think it's very cool to have these related codes together in one place, like you said.
You can even turn it into a reusable hook, a reusable custom hook, which is very easy. It has a very easy API to use it in different components. Whereas if you wanted to do that in Angular, you really needed to build a a class-based service with initialization logic in the constructor and teardown in the onDestroy lifecycle hook. But that's a lot of work to wire all those pieces together. First you have to build this huge, or all this boilerplate of a class with a method and a lifecycle hook and a state and all of this, and then you have to provide it and inject it into this Angular component or directive or whatever, and assign it to a private member so you can use it in the correct lifecycle hooks of the Angular component. So Angular is heavily focused around components and services and directives, and everything has to be injected into the constructor, and just instead of just having a function you can call basically.
Exactly. So that will be your first encounter. So
what was difficult in React?
What I found more difficult in React
when learning React, what was challenging?
Well, when you're going to React and you're going especially to functional React, you're going to be most close to other way. You're more encouraged to functional composition over inheritance and component composition, even though I believe it's very, very similar in React and Angular, and you have these building blocks that is components patterns. Like you will have the smart or container component, presentational component, and these components, those patterns and those concepts exist in both frameworks. So if you have built that mental model, it's not that hard to imagine how you will build something in React and Angular at the same time. However, if you're using functional component, yes, there is like a step there when you have to change the way you see the life cycle of your components, and that may be at this point the hardest thing. Then you realize that you don't have forms, you don't have routing, you don't have dependency injection, and you have to go out there and fishing and see what is the best thing for you. And that's maybe something that I don't like that much about React, and I like more in Angular, that you already have what the tools that you need, and you know they are going to work just fine, even if you don't like it and you want to go to see something outside the box and try to find an alternative. But the possibility to just start and have it there, I think, is a big advantage in Angular.
We got a question from the community. This is a guy called Hunter Jennings, and he says, one thing that I found difficult when switching from React to Angular development was their very different component composition models and patterns, specifically around dynamically creating and passing components as data. React and its API for passing components as data are props I found to be extremely ergonomic, and it allowed me to better compose and render components dynamically. I found this pattern especially hard to match with Angular development. And then I asked him as a follow-up questions, when you say passing components as data in React, do you mean the children input that we can forward to child components? And he responds, that's part of it, although I am aware that the children pattern can partially be modeled through content projection in Angular. I think what I'm referring to mainly is the pattern where one stateful component can be passed as prop to another stateful component. And then he writes an example here of a React button with an icon, and you can pass in the children, of course, to be content projected as the main content of this button. But then you can also pass in an icon component for the icon of this button, and the click handler, and whether it's the primary or the secondary or the orange or the blue button or whatever. That's kind of his question here. How can you model something like that in Angular? It doesn't seem very clear.
I don't think you can, because this is something that I think when I mentioned that Angular follows web standards more than React. So the Angular's model is basically what you have inside web components. You need content projection because a web component has a shadow DOM, and then you need a way to project something, to render something inside the shadow DOM, but have it physically outside of the DOM. And this is what content projection is in Angular. And in React, they just don't, it seems like they, like the model in React passing components, this and there, is just different. So it has nothing to do with, at least to my understanding, maybe I don't know more about philosophy of React when it comes to following web standards, but I haven't seen like the dimension of shadow DOM or something when it comes to React. So it is a lot easier to do in React than in Angular. And yeah, but definitely the content projection is a lot more difficult to work with than just passing a component as children inside prop, right, and just rendering it. Yeah, but this is again, this is because React doesn't have a compiler, and we do not like JSX is not React's compiler. React doesn't have a compiler. It's not a compiled framework as opposed to Angular or Svelte. And because React doesn't have a compiler, so lots of things become easier. So, for example, bindings like props and so on can be resolved dynamically in runtime. Versus in Angular, you need to have a template, you need to have children defined, at compile time, so that Angular compiler sets up bindings and so on. And React in general is a lot more dynamic. So this is fact, right? It's more flexible. It's easier to do lots of things that, especially before Ivy in Angular, took some good amount of work and understanding of internals. But lots of this comes from the compiled nature of the framework. And but again, compiler has lots of advantages. For example, speed. Like, you can compare however you want. Angular will always be faster than React. People say that React has virtual DOM that makes it faster. This is not true. This is what makes it slower, not faster. This makes it more flexible, but definitely not faster. So this is not, like, it's a good question, but the comparison, you cannot compare it. Like, we need to compare React or Angular to Svelte or other compiled framework and say how then all those inputs. This is my view.
And you're right here, Max, that Angular's content projection is modeled closely after the web components slots and name slots. So we have the same concepts in Angular. We have the NgContent, and we have the NgContent with the select attribute. But a very important point that you also make is that this has to be known at compile time. So you can't just at runtime pass some random component into an Angular component, because it needs to know it at compile time, because Angular is like taking all the source code and building it into, these days it's the Ivy instruction set. So the only way of doing it dynamically would be to wrap it in an actual web component using Angular elements. Then you can do the dynamic content projection with any framework even. So that's a powerful thing, of course, but takes some more boilerplate code, and it's not a really good story at this point. Angular elements still need some love to get there, because it produces too large bundles even at this point. There is, however, many more ways to structure these compositions of components in Angular. You can combine a component with a directive, so you could mark a piece of a template with a directive saying this is the icon part of the thing I'm passing here. Or you could do the NgContent select and then have some icon component wrapper just for this purpose. Or you could pass a template ref to it, or you could pass a component type and render it using NgComponent outlet. So there are actually a lot of different ways to do this with Angular, but it really needs to be statically analyzable for the most part.
Yeah. And what's important is that those are separate mechanisms than, for example, like in React, you can get everything through the props. So you don't need to know anything beyond that, right? So a prop can be of any type, including a component. In Angular, yes, you need to be familiar with more concepts. And but this is, but me personally, I like it. So somebody may not like it. I don't know. I was learning web components through Angular, actually. That's a funny thing. I first found it in Angular, then I went outside and Googled and got familiar with the concepts around web components. And so I really like technologies that challenge me, and that I can learn something from, and not just have them as utility, something that I just need to use and be done with it.
Nate, Nacho, anything to add?
I think Max's explanation of where the problem was really good, better than I could do it. So I only have to add the JS. It's harder to do in Angular than React, but you know now why it is that way, and how more approachable to the classic web development and web component it is. So you have to look at it with a different angle.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to either of those. I will say though, I do agree with Max that just because a framework or a pattern is maybe a little more complicated or forces you to do a little more research or learn about, a new concept, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like you can pick up a lot of useful information doing that.
Yeah.
With React, you don't really need to extend a thing to pass some props on. You can just spread the props to a child component. So there's some pattern there that's very flexible and hard to mimic in the Angular world, if not impossible.
And yeah, but this is because of JSX compiler, and because actually the HTML or JSX that you write is not JSX, it's just JavaScript. So basically you can do anything.
Yeah, they're just
that
data
JavaScript
structures,
can
right?
do.
They are just data structures, so of course you can assign any property.
Yeah. That's where the flexibility comes from, because it's JavaScript, it's very dynamic, it doesn't have a compiler. In runtime, it can do lots of things. I think Angular could maybe offload some of that to runtime. Like, for example, decorators, maybe they could have used different mechanism to not use decorators. That decorators probably pretty easier to work with when you're using compiler. So, but yeah, they could have used different data structures instead of compilers, I think.
Let's take one more question from the community. This question is from Matt Vaughn from AngularArchitect.com. He asks, how are React developers sharing code these days? For example, library projects, NX-style workspaces, monorepos. So how do you share code between applications or libraries or projects?
Okay, I can go with this one and talk a bit about my experience and what I have seen out there. So basically, I believe that the standard nature of React developers and React projects out there is to keep monolithic projects with perhaps some packages in NPM with some views and models, but there is not such movement like in Angular to build monorepos and make more fragmented architectures. However, since NX has adopted React, I have used it for almost every project that I had been that they had led me. Sometimes for this same thing, they keep like a standardization between different teams in our organization. I had been asked not to use NX and use like these monolithic structures, like a typical React application. But in my case, in every time I have the possibility, I have used NX, I have used libraries as a division for my project and create my different kind of libraries and create a ledger architecture with restriction between dependencies and progressive builds and progressive tests and that all that goodness that NX provides. But I think that still NX, since it born with Angular, it hasn't had the acceptance in the React community. I believe there is still some educational work to do there, but I'm sure that when React developers start using it more and start understanding what the architectural benefit for large applications are using this kind of approach, it will be a lot of more adoption of it. So that's what I have seen out there. I'm not sure if you have another view of this.
Just to add to that, I haven't seen NX thrown around too much in the React community either, but let me see. I've experience with library projects. I've seen a few monorepos, especially some using Lerna, but nothing with too much consistency, right?
Yeah, we're working so that React community embraces NX. There is definitely a lot of work needs to be done, like education, right? So that because first people need to at least be familiar with something. At least they need to know that there is an alternative to Lerna, for example, right? Because And then maybe they give it a try in personal project. Then another step, maybe. And so it's a long process. It's difficult. Yeah.
I know that Jason Jean from Narwhal is writing a book about monorepos with NX CLI.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's kind of a version of the original Angular book. And I believe so. I believe that when you find out that, hey, forget about all the architectural benefits that you get if you apply these patterns. You have the Angular CLI in React. That's like, didn't you miss that? Didn't you ever heard about the Angular CLI? I know how much better than the Create React app. That's the closest that you have. So you have it. They are giving you for free, and then you have a lot of interesting things that we may have to make just a podcast about, talking about why to use NX with React or Angular or any JS framework supported right now. But in general, I believe that yes, we have to maybe from the in-depth community promote it a bit more and start making a bit more of lighting upon this. That is such a great tool, and we love so much. At least I know that I do.
Okay, so
yeah,
do you?
Tooling is great in Angular. It seems like Angular focused on tooling and React focused more on runtime, because React has great, at least when it comes to performance, for example, and so they have really good debugging tools, and they do lots of experimentation with runtime because they have this like suspense and the other interesting approaches, whereas Angular, it seems, focused more on build time and on tooling, and I think it makes sense, right? Because lots of enterprise need good tooling. So yeah, then we're going to see React taken using something from Angular, React community using some tooling approaches, or through Nx or some other project, and maybe Angular community adopting something from React from runtime. So
I was reading an article recently on the dev community, and it's called In Defense of the Angular Framework. It was published the 1st of June this year, and he's primarily a React developer coming to Angular, and he heard all these stories about Angular is so hard to learn, and we have been talking about recently that it's probably easier to go from Angular to React because the learning curve is is not as steep, and you already have some of the most complicated concepts learned. But he's coming from the other direction, and where people are saying it must be so hard for React developers to learn Angular. So we actually have another special guest joining us today. So I would like to welcome Zane Suhadolnik, if that's not butchering your name too much.
That was actually perfect, yeah.
Welcome, Zane. Please tell us a little about yourself.
Hi, I'm Zane, or in my native language it's Jane, but that's, I guess, too difficult for some people to pronounce a lot of the time, so Zane. I'm a front-end developer from Slovenia. I was originally primarily a React developer, but I found myself working on an Angular application and wrote an article basically defending Angular from a React developer's perspective.
Yes, and that's kind of the reason we have you here today, because I think we are 4 panelists here who all started in Angular before React and moved to React or switched back and forth. So we really wanted that perspective of the experience of coming from React to Angular, because we have been working with the hypothesis that it's easier to learn React when you already know Angular than the other way around. And that, I guess that's also the impression you had before you actually had any experience yourself with Angular. So please tell us a little about that experience.
So I think when I was starting to actually learn web development, of course you learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but then you're basically forced into a framework because that's the way everything is done. And you're Googling around, you're reading about things, and of course you come to Angular, React, and Vue. When I was reading about Angular or React, because those were the two big ones, I think they still are basically, a lot of people were bashing Angular. A lot of people were saying RxJS and TypeScript are the two things that are the most complicated to learn, and that it's basically not for the average developer or someone who's just starting out, so just pick React. And I guess I just kind of went with it, because who am I to know what framework or technology is better as someone who doesn't know them? So I was steered into React. Initially, I worked with it for a year and a half. And also in my free time, I was making a lot of stuff in the React ecosystem. I was trying out everything from Gatsby to styled components, emotion CSS, everything that's in the ecosystem. And when I switched jobs, I was basically put on a Angular application development. And my first job was to update it from Angular 7 to 9. I thought it was going to be a pain, but it was actually a joy to upgrade everything, because everything is so standardized. You don't have that in React. You don't have a lot of standardizations. Even best practices are best avoided in React, as a lot of people have been saying, that they prefer the openness of React, right? But in all honesty, when you're just starting out, as I was, you want a bit of direction. You want that standardization, that's, basically that people who are a lot smarter than you want to tell you how to do things, and you're basically just trust them, right? React is, I think, more for people who already know what they want to do, and they can just bring in whatever packages they want.
That's definitely a mainstream opinion. And you ran into that mainstream opinion that Angular is more complicated and very difficult to learn, even if you know React or Vue or anything like that.
Yeah, that you're basically learning an entire ecosystem, an entire framework, plus TypeScript, plus RxJS. But as I figured out, it was a lot better that way.
Well, I must say that I did AngularJS before Angular version 4 when I joined, and it was a lot to learn, both in terms of modern ECMAScript and TypeScript and RxJS, as you say, and observables and all of that. So of course, there is a lot to learn before you can actually get your hands dirty, it seems like. But the tooling
it's definitely not a beginner-friendly framework. It throws way too much at you at one moment, and you're just kind of left there to figure it out.
Well, the tooling has improved a lot, and something like StackBlitz can also help you a lot, because then you kind of just write some code and you don't have to worry about all the tooling and the setup and the whole ecosystem. So that's a good way to start out, and there's even a couple of tutorials on the Angular websites, which I must admit are not as nice as the one on the React website.
I would have to agree with the tutorial point. I think React's documentation is just better. I think they know what kind of people they're targeting, and while React just kind of goes through the points and just kind of explains them in a certain way so that you actually understand them and use them. Angular really does not do that.
There's a whole novel on just the routing of Angular, and that's not even covering all the details. And for React, it's like one page and you're good to go. Mm-hmm. So that's a kind of a interesting perspective. Okay, Zane, so what were the kind of the things that made you stop up and say, okay, this is definitely different when you came to Angular?
In what way? I mean, from what I was used to with React, or in general?
Okay, so we could start off with the JSX versus many files per component.
Okay,
CSS-in-JS and React.
So I guess I'm also a minority, because again, on the React side, when people were adopting it, I think in 2013, 2014, a lot of people, when they saw JSX, they thought that was the most ugliest thing they've ever seen. But I'm actually, once you actually read a lot of it, it makes a lot more sense in that way. For instance, conditional rendering is just intuitive. It's if this, then you render this. If not, you render this, or you return, or whatever. Conditional rendering in Angular is a little bit trickier. You need to do the whole ngIf, and then you need to make a template, and so on and so forth. So it's not as clean in Angular as it is in React. I also think Angular templating has a lot more of these little like semantic quirks that you have to do, like you have the brackets around certain attributes to do two-way data binding or one-way data binding or whatever. Whereas in JSX you just do JavaScript. You just have to know JavaScript.
Yeah, there's definitely, the Angular templates are a whole new language to learn. There's a lot of syntax and a lot of operators that does special things.
Yeah. Whereas in React, you just, whatever you have in that same file, you can put into the template. There's a lot, there is a few gotchas, but I think the React team's doing a really good job of fixing them. Like fragments were a big thing when I first discovered that. So you don't have to wrap everything in a div.
Yes, I also remember that was kind of a gotcha in the beginning. So, okay, so which one do you like? Or is there any of them you kind of dislike? Or did you get used to the Angular way of splitting the template from the component model, from the styles, from the tests, from the module, from the service, all of that?
I think once you just figure out that every file just has its own purpose and use, then it's pretty easy to just use it, right? Or to have that model in your head. The biggest, I'm not going to say issue, but the biggest thing that I had to switch in my mind was that React is more and more moving away from OOP, right? It's not really using this anymore. You know, they're moving away from this dot set state. They're moving into functional components. They're moving into stateless components. They're moving into hooks, right? As well, and when you start doing Angular stuff, it's just object oriented all around. It's constructors. It's this. It's
very class oriented.
Yeah, very class oriented. Well, as React is moving away from that. That's I think that you're learning two paradigms now. You're doing two things at the same time.
You did mention in your article that I guess you knew a little TypeScript before going into Angular day-to-day development, but you did learn a lot about TypeScript after starting using Angular, because Angular uses it very heavily and intentionally.
Yeah, definitely. TypeScript was something on my list to learn because it was blowing up, basically. But if you're a single developer, if you're making small apps, small React apps, small, I'm not going to say Angular, but let's say another framework apps or whatever, TypeScript doesn't really shine when you're making small projects. It shines when you're making really big stuff, when stuff has to be standardized, when you need a lot of interfaces so that maybe requests don't send something that you don't want to, where you have 3 or 4 people working on the exact same app and you want to keep code clean, you want everything to be reusable, you don't want a lot of any types, you want everything to be typed. And in that sense, yeah, Angular is great in that it forces you to use TypeScript. I'm gonna say that it's great that it forces you to use TypeScript. I think TypeScript is great.
Yeah, TypeScript kind of grew alongside Angular. Angular was the first project to make it really popular because it was around a long time, even before Angular, but it was never really popular. It was competing with CoffeeScript and Dart back in the day. And version 1 of TypeScript was pretty different than what we have today. Anyways, Angular uses TypeScript for 2 very specific things. It uses it for dependency injection, so Angular, as you know, has a compiler, so it goes and checks the types that you are injecting, and usually it can just, based on that, figure out that this symbol for injecting or token for injecting some dependencies, a service or maybe you're querying for a view child of some directive or component. So that's a place where TypeScript actually combined with Angular's compiler makes you have a little less boilerplate, except there's still a lot of boilerplate to connect all the pieces compared to just JSX. The other place where Angular uses TypeScript is for obviously the decorators, which is still to this day an experimental feature. And the experimental decorators that Angular uses are actually, they were based on an old standard proposal for TC39, which is abandoned by now. And there's a new one out there, which has a little different syntax and different semantics. So at some point, TypeScript and Angular probably has to, join the new standard proposal and maybe help get it standardized, or we will be stuck with custom syntax for the rest of the life of this product.
So I actually, when it comes to decorators, I don't have that much experience. I guess TypeScript is just, for me, is more of type safety, right? To write better code, to write better semantic code, and so that it's safer when a lot of other people are working on the project. Other than that, I guess I don't have that much experience with it. I haven't done a lot of with decorators or I think it's like optional chaining something was just released. Is that the way you say it? I think it's optional, something optional in chaining.
Yeah, the new null operators.
Right, yeah, that.
But anyways, the decorators, that's where you have this add component, add NgModule, add injectable, all of that. Angular doesn't really use it at runtime, which is kind of the decorator pattern is, changing something, usually at runtime, or in compiled languages at compile time. Angular actually uses it more as compiler annotations for stitching the whole thing together when it's compiling and bundling into regular JavaScript. But a lot of people have adopted the use of decorators and put it into libraries, so they are actually using them at runtime. But now we have a non-standard feature floating around in libraries and people's application code, which is a thing I personally have seen a few times before. At some point, the standard catches up and even takes over or advances beyond that custom thing. For example, that was the case with CoffeeScript, which is not, it was really popular many years ago, but once the standard caught up, people saw no reason to use it anymore. Now we're starting to see the same thing with TypeScript. There's this decorator thing, and now there are private fields, which is kind of clashing with the private access modifiers of TypeScript. So how will TypeScript converge with that? I guess only time will tell. For now, we have two competing standards, the standard and the TypeScript standard. So that's kind of interesting. Anyways, it was just to say that decorators was added to TypeScript specifically to make Angular switch to TypeScript, because Google had a project called AppScript that was a separate thing, a competing language. So it's kind of an interesting history.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So the next thing you might have kind of experienced when coming to Angular is directives. Zane, what do you think about those?
To be honest, again, not really used directives. So if you could give me like a explain like I'm 5 thing about directives. I'm trying to understand them, but they're really, I don't see what the core like simplified use case is for directives.
Nate, Max?
So the question is, what do we need, directives or?
Yes.
It's basically, as I see it, is a mechanism to make changes to DOM. And that's the only way, because Angular is a compiled language. So you compile it, you compile a template only once, but you need to have a way to introduce dynamic stuff into a template. So you need to have some kind of mechanism. There are no directives in React, because React is, you can return from render whatever you want. And it is, so imagine if render in React would be triggered just once, then how else could you make a changes, return 2 divs instead of 1 and so on. So, but because render is triggered every single time, it's kind of, you can make a parallel comparison to like the directive is also triggered every single time, like specific lifecycle methods inside the directive. So basically, render in React is triggered every single time when React runs reconciliation, right? Or if we're talking about functional components, they unless certain specific conditions are true, like props haven't changed, right? Or and the state hasn't changed. But the idea is that during reconciliation, you have a way to return represent different view, right? Different DOM nodes. And so the same thing in Angular. Every directive has a way during change detection to make a change to the view. Instead, it is split. Like for example, in React, when you have a component, you have a list. So you will just use JavaScript, right, to build a list of just 6 elements. Then in one of those elements, you can add a class. So you would use, again, just JavaScript. But in Angular, you would have, instead of having this all put into one component in React, you would have 3 directives that do different things, right? So you
okay.
kind of, you use ng4 to build a list. Then you use like ng class on each element to add a class, then and so on. So it's like a mechanism to make changes. But again, the main reason is because Angular compiles a template only once. You still need to have something. So.
Yeah. It doesn't do dynamic rendering the same way as React does, because React re-renders every time state changes, right? So
I would put it as like, because it can have lots of optimizations and so on, it may never result in actual re-rendering.
Okay.
But React gives you opportunity to make changes every single time it goes through reconciliation or change detection process, right? And Angular gives you the same, basically, just through different mechanisms.
Okay.
I would say it's as Max says, you get the lifecycle hooks, so that the Angular framework will call this directive at certain moments in the lifecycle of the component it's attached to. So it's a way to encapsulate a piece of DOM manipulation and reuse it across components, which you could just do with any function that returns JSX in React and mix that into your existing components, which is, I guess, more lightweight and easier, a bit easier to learn maybe.
Yeah.
So those are directives. What about Angular modules? What do you think about those, Zane?
I guess Angular modules is okay. So app.module.ts to me is just a file where you have to declare imports and declarations for services and everything else. Apart from that, I still don't understand this, and I was talking to a few people and they really couldn't explain it well. Because React has component, and that's like a
core
an
building
encapsulated
block.
Yeah, a core building block, and it encapsulates UI and logic and everything. But what does a module then do? Isn't that a component in a certain way to say that, or no? Am I having that wrong in my head?
It's definitely one of the more difficult things to learn as a newcomer, because they do so many different things. And I hear that Max wants to explain some of that.
Okay.
Yeah, well, my thinking is at this point, we need modules just to introduce new providers lazily into the application.
Right, so that you're just doing lazy loading.
Yeah, but specifically providers, right? Because you can lazy load a component, like even in React, right? You can just load a component and directly render it as a child. And in Angular with Ivy, you can as well just load a component and just render it. I'm not sure this is currently supported, but even if it's not, just a few versions later, it definitely be easy to do with the Ivy.
Well, this is the thing. When you lazy load a component now, even with Ivy, the module is still the thing that gives you the compilation context to stitch together the element selectors or the element names you're using in your component template to make other components and directives and pipes available to that component. So if you don't use the modules, you can only have this component and it doesn't know about any other component in the whole application, unless you go in and use dynamic rendering, which is kind of more imperative.
Yeah, it is true, but I personally not sure how valuable is encapsulation. Like React doesn't have it, right? There is no, like if you use a component from a different module, is it really a problem? That kind of problem that requires an infrastructure built around just figuring out that you used a component that you're not supposed to use. Like React doesn't have it, and so this encapsulation, I think it was very much
for the compiler.
Yeah, and my thinking is that at this point, modules are important to bring providers or services lazily into change detection. And maybe as a like logical unit of grouping.
Well, we do have a lot of options with tree-shapable providers nowadays. There's even 2 new keywords in Angular 9, the any, provided in any, and the provided in platform, and we of course have the provided in root. So it's in a few cases that we use modules for providers nowadays.
Yeah, but I mean, if you need a provider not for the entire scope, but you have a module like a dashboard, and you just need to have a service specific for that dashboard, then you would lazy load it, and you don't need like provided in root. But I'm curious. Maybe Nate can tell us like how it is done in React, because in React you have providers, right, as well, so through like context.
The context.
Yeah,
and no. Yeah. You can, but you don't have to.
Right, exactly. But I mean, this is something that the community didn't really appreciate. Maybe React community, I'm not sure. But I heard that Facebook itself is built 100% on context. Like this thing is heavily used for Facebook itself. But I don't like in the community. I don't know. So Nate, maybe you can tell us because you've been.
Yeah, I know context has been used a lot, but just like lately, a lot of the applications I've been working on have been using like Apollo and GraphQL libraries, for example. And I think previously you would use context to pass around like the results from a query or some other data that you might get. Like you would actually get those kinds of components that you could import directly from like the Apollo library, let's say. But these days I've just been using hooks for everything, and I've yet to come across a scenario where I really needed context. So for at least most of the basic scenarios, I haven't really found a need for it.
But you mean you can use a hook like use context? Oh, not context. Like how do you? So I assume there are some hooks that under the hood use something similar to context.
I believe so. There's a use context.
Getting something from but use context. Oh yeah, use state. This is for local component state. But yeah, so use context. Is it works? Does it work similar to how the context works with providers and so?
With providers, gosh, it's been so long since I've built anything in Angular. I feel a little out of place speaking on it.
No. I mean,
context
in
providers.
React, because you use this element inside JSX.
Yeah. And I think it's most commonly used for like. My understanding of the context stuff in React is it was there to avoid having to prop drill when you wanted to pass data from a higher component several children down, right? As opposed to constantly drilling that down by passing it as props. You could just use context.
It was to have data globally available to the entire tree of React components, yeah.
Right. So like what I've noticed recently is, especially with tools like Apollo, for example, if they offer, like Apollo has a cache, which is kind of similar to, say, kind of like the global store you'd have in Redux, right? It's a similar concept where it's this kind of global state that can be available to any component in your application. So
now that we are on that topic, something new just came out from Facebook recently, Recoil, which I think is a little similar to how you use class-based services to stitch together components that rely on the same state in Angular, because they live in kind of a separate space from the component tree. But once a change happens, the tree of change detectors and views in Angular will react to that and re-render. If you optimize well, it can re-render only the parts of your component tree and your DOM that needs to change. And that's, from my understanding, part of what Recoil tries to solve, and it's based on hooks, so it has a modern API for React applications.
Yeah, I watched the talk about Recoil from the main guy who built it. Interesting concepts, but I mean, I tried to think about how we can do that in Angular, and well, if you could easily create a service in Angular that would be shared between multiple components, and that would be like similar to Recoil, where you create a part of state that you want to share between multiple components. Then, like, I mean, it seems like many of these ideas, such as like Redux, Apollo, GraphQL, or context provider, or Recoil, or NGRX in Angular, or service-based, they're technically different, but maybe I'm not that qualified, but I don't see like huge difference between in ideas. Like, you know, the ideas, they build around same ideas, it seems to me, or similar ideas. You still want to have state shared between stuff.
They solve the same problem, definitely.
Yeah, and you can do that with any solution. And yeah, just like we talked last time, it will probably be very difficult or impossible to actually prove that one is better over the other.
I think it just depends, again, for the use cases and what people already understand. Because if you're someone that was a big Redux user and you want to go into, I don't know, NGRX or whatever is coming out, I think you're going to look more. I mean, I'm talking here as a beginner or someone who's a lot of the time still, you know, being met with concepts and words that I haven't heard before, right? So I'm going to be looking at things that already kind of match my mental framework of what I know before. So I think they probably solve the same problem, as you said, in different ways, but they still solve it. Mm-hmm. So I think it just comes down to developer experience. I think if we're going to do like a winner or what's going to be more popular, what's going to be the better developer experience? Because at the end of the day, the user doesn't care, right? The app needs to work.
Yeah, but sure, that's true. Like what's familiar, that's easier. And what's easier is probably what we're going to use. But also the amount of information out there also I think has a big impact on what you choose to use. Like if every second article about web development is about React, I think that sooner or later you will switch to React. Either because, like, I don't know, I've been recently involved in, like, started reading a lot about politics and you know, propaganda and that kind of stuff, and just I'm just shocked how easy it is to manipulate people's, you know, opinions and stuff. And I think this also applies to technologies. Like it is, if we have an abundance of information about technology A, which it could be inferior to technology B, but if you will have lots of information about that, it will just seem like everybody's using it. Then probably I need to use it too. And
yeah, exactly. That's why I was exactly what I was saying at the beginning was, you know, that's why I gravitated towards React, because it was basically being evangelized, right? It was this new way of doing UI, the best way to do UI. And I mean, yeah, it has a lot of innovations, actually, in my opinion, coming out of it. I think if it wasn't for React and Facebook having this more open source mindset, I don't think we would even get GraphQL, which I think is great technology, right? And also I think the CSS-in-JS framework and opinions and how you do CSS it probably would have been born if it wasn't React, but I think React kind of ushered it into that with the, you know, one file, everything type of doing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You also mentioned about React that it like doesn't use this and just goes away from.
No, not completely. I mean,
Yeah,
you have
yeah, but
the option of using functional, stateless, right? And
yeah, but again, if you just read if you read all the articles about React in the last half a year, I would say 80% will be about functional programming and hooks, right? Or even more. Like
if you're learning React right now, if you're someone who's been doing, I don't know, Ember or Angular or whatever, and you're like, okay, let's try React, I think you should just do hooks and do functional components. Because the community is moving towards that. Libraries are made in that. If you do create React app, it's going to have a functional component starting you out. There's no more. They're moving away from classes. I don't know why. I'm out of my depth from that. I don't know.
Yeah, because Dan wrote a big article about why this is a bad thing. You can Google that. It was, I think, 4 years ago.
Is it because of scope? Is that the?
It's because it's confusing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And yeah, it is confusing. Maybe, I don't know. Like any tool can be confusing if you don't know how it works. I think that is the reason. But again, like whole React stuff is about simplifying it for the user while still making the tool as efficient or effective as the other frameworks or other solutions, or enough to solve the problems. So this just moves towards simplification again. Like you cannot use Angular if you don't know how to use this, but then you can use React if you don't know how to. You can basically use React even if you don't know JavaScript, I would say.
It would be very hard probably, but yeah.
Well, it depends on what kind of tasks you need. Like, for example, just writing simple UI components like buttons and so on. I don't think you don't need to know a lot of JavaScript. Right. But in Angular, that would be difficult. Even for the button, you need to know decorators, you need to know this, you need to know that, you need to know TypeScript. And so, right.
I want to get us back on track. We have a few more topics that we should get around before we have to end this show. The next big thing that I know you got some experience with quickly when joining Angular development, Zane, is RxJS.
Very, very little. I only really understood observables when I started like fully working on this current application. And I still don't fully understand it. What's actually going on, and what is the use? What is it trying to replace? Why is it there? Why can't I just use whatever I'm using on React? But I guess I haven't worked on complex enough applications to really understand. I guess the whole just subscribe to this observable, and when it emits a value, you just handle it. I think that's a great model for people, just watch it. Watch this thing and it will return something when it just does, right? And yeah, everything else I think is just handling that observable response, right?
And remember to get rid of the subscription.
Right, yeah, unsubscribe ng on changes, I know. I mean, ng on destroy, sorry.
I read this article by Ben recently. I don't know if you guys read it.
Is that the creator of RxJS?
Yeah. On dev too.
Well, he's not the creator, but he's the team lead on RxJS.
Okay.
Right now.
Yeah, like I think he's behind the one who started it, maybe, right? Like RxJS, Rx is a concept that's been around for, I don't know, 20 years, right, in different languages.
He joined Ben Lesh joined in version 4 of RxJS.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It was Matt Potwisaki who did it initially, and I think Eric Meyer was part of it as well at Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a great article, very interesting, and where he talked a lot about misunderstanding in terms of the usage of RxJS, and he put a lot of emphasis on observable as the core concept around maybe not RxJS, but like a general programming paradigm. So observable versus promises. So he as I understand, he thinks, and this makes sense to me, that observable is more is better. I don't know the correct word, you have to be careful these days with how you phrase it, but
It's more
yeah, it's
ergonomic and flexible than promises.
Yeah, it's cancelable. Promises are not cancelable, right? So, and it's a great read. And he believes, and I also believe that RxJS is people afraid. RxJS is because of not the observable concept, but because of these operators. There are lots of them and lots of different ways to do one thing and compose them in different ways. And like he writes, you can come back in a month to whatever you wrote, and it's just not possible to understand what is going on there. So this is again like JavaScript's my favorite language. So it's so misunderstood.
Okay, but do we actually need it in React, Nate? Observables.
So
if we split it between like RxJS with operators and observable as a something that can be used instead of promises without the operators also.
Yeah, Lars, just to weigh in there. So as you might know, RxJS is like one of my favorite things to use ever. So I have tried to force it into several of the React projects that I've been working on lately. But honestly, in my experience, no. With hooks, I've been able to do pretty much everything that I would have needed to do otherwise. And just a lot of the APIs that you get with libraries in React are promise-based anyway. So like, yes, you could use RxJS, but it kind of feels like, in my experience, it's felt like I was forcing it. I do miss being able to compose operators together, though. I think it really is a nice kind of ergonomic way of solving certain problems. I remember on what was it? It was one of the early articles that Nicholas Jameson had written for Angular in Depth, where he was talking about the expand operator and how you could use it to consume paginated data, like basically like recursive observables consuming paginated data from an API. And I just was like, it's just such a clean way of solving that problem. It really made me want to use RxJS. So I'm
piping to me is like great. You just put in .pipe and then you put every single operator that you want, one after the other, and you just handle the data as it's coming in.
It is. It's a really kind of clean way of composing things. So I do miss not having it in React, but I can't say I've really felt the need for it yet.
Yeah, same here. When I was doing stuff in React, even using Redux and MobX, I guess wasn't even a necessity. Again, you have hooks now. They do a lot of this stuff for you. I was reading something about Slack using Redux on their like main front end architecture, and they're probably the only company that I've heard where they use two separate stores, which you're not supposed to do. Yeah, because they're doing. I think if I remember correctly, they're using two stores because one store is accessible to some users and the other is like an admin store that a lot of people are not supposed to see. But I think I'm getting that wrong. It's been a while since I read that. But that was just crazy. You're using two stores, which is like the most, it's basically an anti-pattern. And you're a huge company doing two stores. So I guess, I don't know, I would never do that.
Kind of defeats the purpose of Redux, right?
Right, yeah.
Two sources of truth.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to discuss this one, Zane. There's this statement, or there's this popular opinion that Angular is a framework, React is just a library. How did you feel that when coming into Angular, that the batteries included, here's everything you need, you don't even have to go to NPM to find libraries, you can do everything with the Angular packages? Definitely.
I think I guess it's going to be weird to say, but developing in Angular is, like, at first, as we talked, it's intimidating. You're learning a lot of things at the same time. Once you kind of bridge that gap, you feel so safe because everything that's updated, you have forms, you have router, you have the HTTP client, you have RxJS to handle state, you have TypeScript, which is keeping you even more safe. And all of that, I guess, not TypeScript, but all of that, once the new major version comes out, everything gets updated and up to speed with that major version. That's something the React community cannot keep up with. Forms, I think, in general, in React, and they're notoriously difficult to work with. I think Hook forms now are solving that problem really well. I have used it a little bit, but not in depth again. I think there's way too many router people. You have Reach router, you have React router, you have, I think, another one, which is Hooks router. And just when people are starting to use it, they'll be a bit confused as to why. So I love that Angular just opinionizes everything. It does everything the way you want it to, the way they think it should be done. And it's handled very well, because it's parallel, Router is updated when Angular is and forms are and such. But yeah, I think, Angular is the full package, which is why a lot of people are complaining, because they just want to do UI and bring in whatever they need and not having a bloated piece of software. Well, as React, you can just use whatever you need, deploy, and that's it. But at the end of the day, I think Angular even scales better than React in that sense.
What was that like going from Angular to React, Nate or Max?
Yeah, I can also maybe add to the previous question.
Okay.
I believe maybe this is where Angular team or we as a community can do a better job. Just explain that there is Angular core, which is same thing as React. So you can just use Angular core and then use everything else as a third party. You don't need to use Angular module, right? Or Angular forms. You can use something else. Nobody uses, but if you want to compare React, you can compare it to Angular core, which is just a rendering engine.
Yeah,
but if you want to compare
it's the UI layer. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you want to compare the infrastructure, then you start bringing in other packages. But you will still need to learn that, right, in React. So you'll still need a router. You will need if they would add all the packages to React tutorial, then it would be as big maybe as Angular's.
Yeah, have it more standardized, right? But I don't even think React's goal is to be standardized. I think it's just to be this open thing that can be used with whatever you want, right? But my one gripe with React is that it's heavy usage, not anymore, I think, but heavy usage of the Axios package for requests, right? And the Axios package is currently being maintained by one person, which I haven't checked, but I think it's not being maintained well. A lot of issues are cropping up and everything. And I don't think that would ever happen in Angular with the HTTP package. It will always be updated, right? So I don't know, maybe someone can correct me on that thought. I guess that's the way I'm phrasing. I might be phrasing it wrong. I don't know.
So Nate, what is the experience like when coming from Angular to React? Are you missing the barriers included, or how do you find whatever you need for routing and forms and whatnot?
It's a lot of searching around and a lot of trying out different packages. I think I'm on my third router on this project I'm currently working on. I'm just using NextJS because it has kind of built-in routing. But prior to that, I was using the React router and also messing around with the Reach router. So just like when you're on a project, you have deadlines and you're trying to get stuff, done on time and like synced with everyone on your team, having to choose from 3 different routers it takes more time than just having a built-in router that you use. So yeah, that is one thing I have missed along with RxJS is just kind of some of the convenience that you get with something like Angular.
What about the tooling specifically between Angular and React? What are the differences there? Nate, maybe you can start by answering.
Angular CLI was really nice. I think with React, it's mostly create React app. Is there any specific part of tooling you mean, or?
Are you missing anything from the Angular CLI and the Angular test bed or some of the other toolings that comes bundled with the framework?
I guess I can't, nothing in particular. It's something I've noticed less than probably some of the other points we've touched on previously.
What about something like schematics and builders for a large and complex application where you want to split it into several packages or workspace libraries, domains, and so on?
Yeah, so I haven't worked on a React app at that scale yet, but it's definitely something I've heard in the community that crops up is Angular scales better than React, right?
This is actually the gap that the NX toolchain by Narwhal is trying to cover, right, Max?
Yeah, true.
Yeah, NX
One
now
that you
has support for React and Node.js, and yeah, even Gatsby is one of the newest supported frameworks. So you get batteries included package for all the tooling you ever need, and setting up test frameworks and builders and tasks and all of that, and scaffolding things and generating stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. What about testing? Is that something any of you, Zane or Nate, has done heavily in React and or Angular?
Not particularly. I've probably never written a full unit test, so not really. I know that Jest and React testing libraries are like the most popular ones, but no, I haven't really been writing tests. Not even in Angular. Yeah.
I've been using Jest and Enzyme lately with React. It's I mean, it gets the job done. No, I don't have too strong of an opinion on it. It hasn't really like gotten in my way too much yet.
So another important thing that is always all the rage, both in React and Angular, is state management and the related side effects of that. So what are your experiences with that, jumping between the frameworks? Nate or Max, any opinions?
I can go real quick here. With Angular, it's mostly using Redux and NGRX, and then with React, some of the projects I was working on a while ago were using React Redux, but lately I've just been using like Apollo GraphQL's client cache for any global data that I need to share across the entire component tree, and then just using hooks for like local component state management, which I guess to provide an opinion on it, it's been pretty ergonomic.
So you're not, you don't feel more comfortable in one or the other regarding state management?
I did. Moving from Redux into using like GraphQL's client cache for state management was a little strange, just because I was so used to having a middleware layer and using something like Redux Saga or Redux observables and just kind of structuring applications that way, like changes to state that way. So that took a little bit of getting used to, but again, for the applications I've been working on, I haven't missed it too much.
Any of you others have any opinion or experience with that?
No, I don't have much experience, especially in React, so I don't know.
As I said, I haven't worked on such a complex application that I actually had to use a state management library. Everything has just been local state, but I'm really excited to finally get to do something with either Redux or some state management, so I can add it to my like tool chain.
So the Angular does a little magic by default. I don't know if you've met the Zone.js and the NgZone yet, Zane?
No.
So have you experienced the change detection strategy yet in components, Zane?
The change detection strategy? No, not really.
Okay, so you're using NgZone, and it does a lot of dirty checking. Basically, every time something asynchronous happens, such as an HTTP request response gets back to you, or a timeout or an interval is triggered, or a lot of an event listener or a component event binding, every time one of those emits some value, basically it triggers Angular to go and dirty check every component that's active right now by default. Mm-hmm. And for complex applications, that can give kind of a performance hit, and that's where you start to look into the on-push change detection strategy, where components are left alone in the change detection cycle unless they are marked as dirty, meaning they need dirty checking of their template expressions, all of that, or that their input properties have new values assigned using strict equals check. So this is a bit of an advanced topic, and it's not covered, basically not at all, in the Angular documentation, even though it's a very central piece to this whole thing. The problem here is that NgZone goes in monkey patches, or Zone.js goes in monkey patches, all the APIs of the browser, but now with ES 2018 and newer than that, if we output bundles targeting those with TypeScript, we get native. So in the compiled code, we'll get async await if we use that, or any library uses that. And Zone.js cannot patch that because that's syntax. It's not an API. It's not a global object or anything like that you can go and replace. So it's kind of it's an interesting thing right now in Angular, and the team has a new design document, the Angular team, on change detection and changing how that works, because eventually we're going to hit this Zone.js doesn't work in every case anymore. And so now they are once again looking into baking state management into the framework itself, because they have previously said that it doesn't belong there, but now they kind of need some way of having it. I mean, they can provide the low-level APIs that Max has spoken a lot about, like the new Mark 30 and a standalone detect changes function. But those are very low-level, and if we have those, it would be like set state, the set state primitive in React, which we kind of want to avoid in Angular development, going that low level of saying you need to dirty check all the time.
Yeah, because then you're one step away from doing something like a shadow DOM implementation, where you're, if something's different, you have to check two things, and yeah, you're basically in React land then by that time.
I know you have some opinion on this, Max, so just come with it.
Yeah. So right. So this is how it works, and you're saying that what should Angular do? What is the question?
I'm just saying. So React kind of now it has some form of state management built in. You were even saying, Nate, that the hooks are replacing even the places where you forced RxJS for state management. So you have a really nice built-in thing for state management. Whereas in Angular, sure, the default change detection where Angular does all of this black magic involving the ngZone and Zone.js monkey patching basically every global API out there. But that won't work. Even now, if we compile to ES 2018, we have the problem that we can't patch a single weight. So Angular is kind of forced now to have something that manages states and triggers the change detection on a very low level.
Yeah, I think, right. So you're either going to have to trigger that manually, change detection, right? Like React has been doing through set state. In Angular, it will be Mark 30. Or you will have to mix it with the state management, right? If there is a change in state, then it will be the change detection will be scheduled for you automatically. So this is like a second approach. The third approach is probably maybe to compile it into something like what Svelte does. Basically, every assignment to input or to internal state of the component that is used inside the template, right? You can check that, for example, a class has 10 properties, but only 3 of those properties are used inside the template. The compiler can identify those properties and just compile the assignment into something a little bit different, right? Like in Svelte, I think the assignment is compiled into assignment plus the call to something called invalidate or run change detection or Mark 30. So I think this is like the 3 options. I don't know about if there are any others. So yeah.
How does when you just said that if you have 10 properties and 3 of them are only being used on, I assume you're talking about the template.
Yeah.
Template. Mm-hmm. Okay, but what if something is hidden and not being used as of right now? How does Angular then know that that is going to be used eventually?
But it won't, because you
okay.
But this is why we have directives, and you don't have that kind of flexibility. In React, you don't know which property, what state of component state will be used to calculate the view, right? In React, you don't know that. But in Angular, whatever is used in the template, like as a parameter to, I mean, it is probably not going to be very easy, but still, it could be ways to identify those properties and just to compile it into something that, that will look a little bit different when compiled to how you wrote it.
Okay, because I was always wondering how stuff like this is done. How does the actual compiler or whatever is bundling up in the background, how does it know which ones are being used and which ones might get used? How does that know? That was basically my question, and I think you answered it.
Yeah, I think there are already some mechanisms built into compiler, because like right now, if you use something in a template that is not declared on a component, you will get an error, right? I think
it is.
It is already somehow matches whatever expressions that the compiler finds in templates to the structure of a component. So there are already something done in that field.
Yeah.
But I have no information whether this is something that the Angular team considers a route to implement and change detection. So I don't know. It's just based on my knowledge, how I see it could be solved. But yeah, I'm not on the team, so I don't know.
Well, there is a design document right now about reworking the whole change detection thing and how it works, and taking care of some edge cases. And a lot of it involves, one part of it is this mark dirty, this new function that you have covered a lot, Max. It will actually get a lot of options about the scope of the change detections and triggering it. And and the other part is, that's the low level API, but it would be nice for Angular developers to have a more high-level API for state management out of the box, because this is a batteries included framework. So I would be surprised if they're not looking into the state decorators they presented at NGConf 2019, because they are also looking into progressive rehydration of state from server to client. So that would fit very well with that. And now that they're under time pressure to solve this Zone.js problem, maybe they will solve two problems at once.
Yeah, I don't know. Could be.
At the end of the day, developers will use whatever gets the job done. And I think that's, true for UI libraries as we're heading into the future. I think Angular has a very, very good standing ground, but I don't really think it's attracting much attention. React's kind of stealing that from it. And
Vue.
I think, and Vue and Svelte now. So there's 4 frameworks. They're all competing against each other. But I didn't bring this up in the article or even before. My degree theory was to compare Angular, React, and Vue. And I made a simple create, read, and update and delete app in all 3 frameworks. And the criteria was to use the Chrome Lighthouse test and just kind of compare it based on that. And then some developer experience criteria and I think I also compared the source folder size and the final build distribution folder size. And all 3 of them had specific things that they were good at and bad at. And I guess there's no one framework to rule them all. I guess it's just specific to the project that you're working on. And I think Angular is for the feeling safe part. If you know it, I think Angular is a safe bet even for the future.
What was the biggest challenge when learning Angular compared to learning React?
It's a big one, because when I was learning React, I didn't have professional experience. I didn't have production experience of making a single page app. So I think when I was learning Angular, it was a lot of knowledge was still being transferable. I knew JavaScript and CSS and everything a lot more, but I guess just the way Angular handled state, how it was updating data, what specific semantics it had to use to pass data from child to parent or from parent to child. I guess RxJS, as we've mentioned before, and just getting used to kind of adopting TypeScript, right? Because you can only, if you have TypeScript, you might as well use it. Don't just not use TypeScript. I think it's good that you are using it. And the multiple files per component thing was also a challenge. Actual real good resources to learn all of these things and them being up to date. I guess that was the real challenge.
Well, maybe that's even harder in React, because it has been iterating a lot on the component API. So now we have maybe 4 or 5 different ways of doing a component in React. So depending on the year the resources are from, you will see, the old school extend class based and then the actual classes, class-based components, and then functional components. And then we got hooks. So now we could do component or what are they called? Like functional components with life cycles or something like that, right?
Stateless components.
Stateless, So, but they are still, from what I know, they are still all supported. So, so the older resources are still valid, but it's just not best practice anymore.
Yeah, I mean, in my previous job, we were still using 0.14 version of React because it was such a legacy app and everything was still working. So React is backwards compatible. One thing Angular has over React is the CLI. The CLI is just so good. Like, I can't believe how good that thing is. I missed something. As Nate already said, that's something that React does not have. Though, what's his name? Tom Prescott-Werner, who's founder of GitHub. I don't know if you heard this. They're making a framework for React, which is RedwoodJS.
Okay.
And it's a full stack framework using React on the front end. For the between data layer, it's GraphQL, and then on the back end, they're like supporting Postgres SQL. And they have a sort of, they even admitted that their main inspiration for the CLI and the generators and everything was Angular. So I guess that's a step in the right direction for the React community.
Well, if you're missing something like that, I can definitely recommend the NX toolchain. Because it's also full stack, but you can also use it just with React front-end development. It also supports Angular. So even if you have a large code base with multiple frameworks, both on the client side and the server side, it supports a monorepo way of working. Heavily inspired by the Angular CLI. In fact, they helped shape the current form of the Angular CLI. Mm-hmm. And then you also you can also use, I don't know if you've met this yet, but the schematics and migrations and all this ng-generate component, all that, you can actually do your own to extend that and customize it for your project. Or maybe there was some manual task you have to do every time you create a new workspace library or a new component or a new service. And you can do that using just Node.js and the APIs provided by Angular schematics.
Yeah, that's the whole point of schematics, right? So that you can basically generate a component or a service or whatever that you need instead of just doing them manually.
Yes, and then you can hook up with the Builders API, you can hook up your own tooling. Say if you want to use Jest instead of Karma and Jasmine, there are probably builders, or there are builders out there for that out of the box that you can just put into your Angular JSON configuration. But you could even do your own. If you're using something else entirely, you can just build a builder yourself, or you can use Nx has this builder called run command, so you can just hook it up to any terminal command line command for any tooling. So it's a well integrated tool chain, and it I guess what Nx layers on top of the Angular CLI is it has a graph of dependencies when you have a large project with many different projects. So every time you change something in one library, it knows that some other library is depending on this within your workspace. So you can do smart builds, smart tests, smart lints, and smart deploys, so that you're only building, testing, linting, deploying whatever was changed instead of the whole thing in a large project.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's really the enterprise scale tooling. And the tagline of it is work like Microsoft, Facebook, and Google using a monorepo-based approach. But so you might think, well, I'm not Google, I'm just a small shop. But those practices, they still apply. Like, they're still good even to a medium-sized project. Of course, if you're just doing a landing page or a campaign or whatever, yeah, sure, this is over-engineering and overkill. But for like even medium projects, this is a really good way of working. And the tooling is incredible.
I'm gonna finish this little project that I'm trying to use to get back in after my burnout. So after I finish that, I'm gonna be looking into doing more with Angular and I'll definitely take a look at Nx.
Zane, now that you're doing Angular development, what do you miss? What do you miss from React?
Oh God, I guess I miss the fact that there's not a lot of options for different ways of doing CSS, which is weirdly phrased. I'm sorry, but I think you're sort of forced to just use Sass here.
In Angular?
I mean, yeah, Sass or CSS. Just
Sass, Lesh, SCSS, stylus.
Yeah. But
CSS.
I'm talking about the CSS-in-JS stuff.
Oh,
I don't think Angular has really been adopting it. And yeah, I mean, styled components is basically just for React, right?
Yes, it's definitely, there's not anything like that in the Angular ecosystem at this point.
Yeah.
Although we do have a writer right now writing about incorporating CSS modules into Angular components.
Oh, that would be great.
I
guess
I love them. I absolutely love
I
CSS modules with React.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's great. Like, it's one of those things where you're just like, why hasn't this been from the beginning here? Oh, do I miss anything else? Not really, no. I guess I just missed the fact that it's not as covered as React, and that not a lot of people are still using it because it's a great framework. But yeah, I mean, React's really been doing strides, and a lot of projects like Gatsby and NextJS for static, not static site rendering, but
static site generation.
Yeah. You're basically making like some sort of WordPress variation of React. I don't think Angular has that. It's not really made for that. Or are people working on something that I don't know?
Well, there is a product called Scully, Scully.io. I don't know if there's a website called Scully.io, but that's the project name.
Okay.
But it's still pretty new, so I don't know how final and stable it is yet, but it was introduced within the past year, and it's kind of the first of its kind. I mean, Angular actually has some pretty good server-side rendering and even pre-rendering now, so you can use Angular itself. But this Scully thing is more like, so you can, for example, take in markdown files or CSV files and convert them into HTML and build a whole web page of static pages.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's not a full framework like Next.js or Gatsby or something like that. You're right, we don't have that in Angular at this point. And there's a lot of work going on in Vue and React. There's this remix thing coming out with React pretty soon.
Yeah. I still need to. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's from the guys that made React Router.
Yes, its website is, I think it's remix.run.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what they came up with, but it's also a framework on top of React, and there's some server-side involved.
That's also really interesting, is that React has kind of become not even a library or a framework for JavaScript or for UI, but it's itself become like the bottom layer for a lot of tools, right? Like, there's abstractions coming above React now more frequently. So I don't think Angular is in that position as well. You know, that there's abstractions upon Angular.
Definitely.
But I don't think it needs to. It's a full-fledged framework with everything. I don't think so that it needs a lot more abstraction. So
right. I can maybe tell you what I was surprised, or the obvious thing when I came to React from Angular, and I have to say it's the fragmentation of projects. Like, you come into a React project, you have no idea what's going to meet you.
Yeah. I forgot to say that when you were asking me about
which component API is used, which libraries are used for state management,
what linting
forms, and
what linting rules you're using. Everything is per project based. With Angular, everything's the same. You open up an Angular project, a lot of stuff is it's standardized.
It'll be very familiar. Yeah. So, and you can love or you can hate that. I mean, sure, it's less flexibility, but it makes a lot of sense for large corporations when they have many teams, many people onboarding, offboarding all the time.
Yeah,
exactly. You want to hit the ground running. So you want to be familiar with what's already in there and be able to adapt very quickly instead of having to learn 2 new libraries that are used in this particular project. Zane, thank you very much for coming today. I will definitely add a link to your article called In Defense of the Angular Framework.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to do this. It was really eye-opening for a bunch of stuff, and everything that I learned is invaluable, basically. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you. It was very interesting to get an opinion from a React developer joining or coming into the Angular ecosystem for the first time. Very interesting. Mr. Nate Lapinski, thank you for joining us today.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. I'll see you some other time. Max, thank you for coming on the show and sharing your experiences with Angular and React.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So it's great talk.
The deep dive was brought to you by indepth.dev.